2. Classical philosophy is indebted for its wealth, its depth, and its boldness no less than its fertility for future thinkers, to the fact that it narrowed the problem down, confining it within the realm of pure thought. At the same time, it remains an insuperable obstacle even within the realm of thought itself. That is to say, classical philosophy mercilessly tore to shreds all the metaphysical illusions of the preceding era, but was forced to be as uncritical and as dogmatically metaphysical with regard to some of its own premises as its predecessors had been towards theirs. We have already made a passing reference to this point. It is the dogmatic assumption that the rational and formalistic mode of cognition is the only possible way of apprehending reality, or to put it in its most critical form, the only possible way for us, in contrast to the facts which are simply given and alien to us. As we have shown, the grandiose conception that thought can only grasp what it is itself created strove to master the world as a whole by seeing it as self-created. However, it then came up against the insuperable obstacle of the given, of the thing in itself. If it was not to renounce its understanding of the whole, it had to take the road that leads inwards. It had to strive to find the subject of thought which could be thought of as producing existence without any hiatus irrationalis, or transcendental thing in itself. The dogmatism alluded to above was partly a true guide and partly a source of confusion in this enterprise. It was a true guide inasmuch as thought was led beyond the mere acceptance of reality as it was given, beyond mere reflection and the conditions necessary for thinking about reality, to orientate itself beyond mere contemplation and mere intuition. It was a source of confusion since it prevented the same dogmatism from discovering its true antidote, the principle that would enable contemplation to be overcome, namely, the practical. The fact that, precisely for this reason, the given constantly re-emerges as untranscended in its irrationality will be demonstrated in the course of the following account. In his last important logical work, Fichte formulates the philosophical starting point for the situation as follows. We have seen all actual knowledge as being necessary, except for the form of is, on the assumption that there is one phenomenon that must doubtless remain as an absolute assumption for thought, and concerning which doubt can only be resolved by an actual intuition. But with the distinction that we can perceive the definite and qualitative law in the content of one part of this fact, namely the ego principle. Whereas for the actual content of this intuition of self, we can merely perceive the fact that one must exist, but cannot legislate for the existence of this one in particular. At the same time, we know clearly that there can be no such law, and that therefore, the qualitative law required for this definition is precisely the absence of the law itself. Now, if the necessary is also that which is known a priori, we have in this sense perceived all facticity a priori, not excluding the empirical, since this we have deduced to be non-deducible. End quote. What is relevant to our problem here is the statement that the subject of knowledge, the ego principle, is known as to its content, and, hence, can be taken as a starting point and as a guide to method. In the most general terms, we see here the origin of the philosophical tendency to press forward to a conception of the subject, which can be thought of as the creator of the totality of content. And likewise, in general, purely programmatic terms, we see the origin of the search for a level of objectivity, a positing of the objects, where the duality of subject and object, the duality of thought and being is only a special case of this, is transcended, that is, where subject and object coincide, where they are identical. Obviously, the great classical philosophers were much too perceptive and critical to overlook the empirically existing duality of subject and object. Indeed, they saw the basic structure of empirical data precisely in the split, but their program was much more concerned with finding the nodal point from which they could create, deduce, and make comprehensible the duality of subject and object on the empirical plane, that is, in its objective form. In contrast to the dogmatic acceptance of a merely given reality, divorced from the subject, they required that every datum should be understood as the product of the identical subject-object, and every duality should be seen as a special case derived from this pristine unity. But this unity is activity. Kant had attempted in the Critique of Practical Reason, which has been much misunderstood and often falsely opposed to the Critique of Pure Reason, to show that the barriers that could not be overcome by theory, contemplation, were amenable to practical solutions. Fichte went beyond this and put the practical, action, and activity in the center of his unifying philosophical system. For this reason, he says, it is not such a trivial matter as it appears to some people, whether philosophy should begin from a fact or from an action, that is, from pure activity which presupposes no object but itself creates it, so that action immediately becomes deed. For if it starts with a fact, it places itself inside the world of existence and of finitude, and will find it hard to discover the way that leads from there to the infinite and the supersensual. If it begins from action, it will stand at the point where the two worlds meet, and from which they can both be seen at a glance. End quote. Fichte's task, therefore, is to exhibit the subject of the action, and assuming its identity with the object, to comprehend every dual subject-object form as derived from it, as its product. But here, on a philosophically higher plane, we find repeated the same failure to resolve the questions raised by classical German philosophy. The moment that we inquire after a concrete nature of this identical subject-object, we are confronted with a dilemma. On the one hand, this configuration of consciousness can only be found really and concretely in the ethical act, in the relation of the ethically acting individual subject to itself. On the other hand, for the ethical consciousness of the acting individual, the split between the self-generated but wholly inwardly turning form of the ethical imperative in Kant and of the reality, the given, the empirical alien both to the senses and the understanding must become even more definitive than for the contemplative subject of knowledge.